Now, COVID-19 has definitely transformed the modern working landscape, and it has been made possible because of digitalization as well as technologies. This brings us to our next topic. Modern workforce, a smart approach to digital transformation. To tell us more, we have Stephanie Magnus, Principal, Baker and Mckenzie, Wong and Liao. Michael Michalandos, Chair, Asia Pacific Employment and Compensation Practice Group, Baker McKenzie. And Celeste Ang, Principal, Baker McKenzie, Wong and Liao, plus Sonia Wong, Special Counsel, Baker and McKenzie. Let's welcome all of them.
Thank you very much, and really, really good for you guys to meet us and speak with us today. And today's topic really is the modern workforce, a smart approach to digital transformation. And so why smart? You know, we're living in a smart world at the moment with smart living, and that really is a trend for us to improve standards in different aspects of our day-to-day lives, as we live, as we work, and as we play. How buildings are built, what our transport systems are, and the services and products which are devised with us in mind, and companies that provide these solutions. So with that in mind, we at Baker McKenzie devised a smart framework which seeks to focus on clients, on companies, and their legal considerations that you need to pay attention to as you embark on your digital transformation journey. And so SMART really is a mnemonic. S stands for smart technology. Certainly the technology that we need to pay attention to and use in our digital transformation journeys. M, which we're coming back to and going to be the focus of this session, stands for the modern workforce. A stands for aggregated data. Certainly data being the new oil and the currency in this particular climate. R for regulation and regulators as laws change and evolve, as products and services, new products and service lines are built with your digital transformation journey. And lastly, transactions, which stand for partnerships and transactions that you may enter into as you embark on your journey. But for today, we are going to focus on M, the modern workforce, and what approach we need to take in this digital transformation landscape. Now, joining me are our Asia Pacific employment colleagues from Baker McKenzie, from Hong Kong, from Australia, and from right here in Singapore, who will focus our discussion on the modern workforce, including building flexibility into your workforce, moving towards a more virtual workforce, and an outlook on how workforce may evolve and how should employers now adapt and prepare. So if I could perhaps start with Celeste. Now, Celeste, it will be interesting to understand what you're seeing and whether your clients are embracing remote working practices.
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, I think for some clients or for some companies, embracing, the term may be appropriate. I think for others, in this age, probably the more appropriate term might be compelled, to adopt remote working practices. But in any case, the short answer is that, clients are certainly adopting and starting to adopt remote working practices for certain sections of their workforce. We've had questions around, whether certain processes may be transferred to an online platform, for example, submission of resignation letters. And clients are at least starting to reimagine, right? I mean, this term reimagine, so they're starting to reimagine their working practices, as well as their human resource and talent management processes.
Thank you. That's certainly very interesting. And maybe if I could ask Michael, what are the main considerations employers need to think about when considering remote working on a continuing basis?
Look, good question, Stephanie. There are a number of key considerations. Firstly, the employer needs to consider whether a remote working option will be offered to all employees or only certain classes. For example, remote work may not be appropriate for junior employees or employees who may require detailed supervision. Employers should develop application requirements which set out matters such as the nature of the remote work for which the employee is applying, minimum seniority for remote work, any excluded positions, and objective criteria which the employee may consider in determining an application for remote work. In making these decisions, employers will need to ensure that they do not discriminate on unlawful grounds. Setting up criteria in advance and applying them consistently will certainly assist. Second, the employer should consider whether the arrangements will be temporary or permanent. If they are to be permanent, the employer should consider any circumstances where it may wish to bring remote work to an end. Thirdly, employers should impose some limitations on where the work can be performed. This is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, employment laws are quite aggressive, and if an employee starts working in another jurisdiction, then local laws may apply and the employer may find itself in breach of these laws. Complex issues relating to working visas and even taxation may also arise. Secondly, in many jurisdictions, and particularly in Australia, employers have strict obligations to ensure that the place of work is safe. This is difficult to do with travelling employees. Finally, employers also are likely to find that their post-employment restrictions are not enforceable in other jurisdictions. It's also important that employers properly document these arrangements in a written agreement with each employee. And finally, it's important that employers train their managers as to how to manage employees who are working remotely. This is a new way of working, and we have already seen a number of claims in Australia where remote working employees have complained things about blunt emails from managers, a lack of instruction and direction, being forgotten or excluded from meetings, not being kept up to date on matters, that work-life boundaries haven't been respected, and on occasions, employees being accused of stealing stationery.
That's great feedback, Michael, and certainly food for thought. Maybe if I could turn a question to Sonia. Now, Sonia, isolation of remote workers is often identified as a key concern for many employers. Do you have any tips for employers in this regard?
Yes, thanks, Stephanie. Yes, it's very important to stay connected with remote workers. So communication is the key. Many employers are considering setting up regular video chats with their team, for example, by setting up virtual weekly meetings to check in and see how their employees are doing. It's important to engage with their employees and have a strategy of engagement. Secondly, it's also important to increase employees' awareness on their responsibilities and the importance to take care of their own physical and mental well-being. Many employers are right now offering informational and practical tools to support positive mental health. Thirdly, it's also very important to encourage structures and encourage boundary settings. Do not expect employees to be always available 24 hours per day, because there was a survey in Japan which shows that the issue of the ambiguity of working time and time off was the highest ranked disadvantage of remote working. As Michael mentioned earlier, there has already been claims about employees not being respected with regard to their work-life balance. In some jurisdictions, there's a statutory right to be disconnected. So it's crucial to have clear guidelines on working time arrangements that are in line with applicable local laws. So fourthly, it's also important to provide reasonable accommodations to employees who may be in need of special arrangement because of family obligations or disabilities. In some jurisdictions, there are laws regarding providing accommodations. So for instance, some employees who may have family obligations may find it difficult to work remotely because of schools' lockout or closures. So in these circumstances, employers may consider providing flexibilities in terms of working hours, but it's very important to clarify how the employee's performance will be managed and measured. Fifthly, it's also important to provide trainings on managers as to how to manage remote workers, and some employers are also providing mental health trainings to their employees. Also, some employers provide employee assistance program to provide for confidential counseling and referral services. Employers should make sure that these resources are publicized and readily accessible to employees to avoid employees being put off by the stigma attached to mental health issues. Some employers may also hold online social gatherings or activities such as online retreats and online town hall meetings, and these may be helpful in your organization. And in the events that your organization may be undergoing certain restructurings or retrenchments, then you may consider providing enhanced transparency to your employees, because this reduces the risk of employees feeling depressed because of the anxiety, uncertainty, and insecurities. So remember, remote workings requires trust as well as digital infrastructures. So trust in people's reliability, capability, and motivation is very important.
Those are great tips, Sonia. Now, I've heard a little bit about from you, and there, is a possibility, certainly, of claims and complaints. And maybe if I can address this question to Michael, are there any terms that should be included in a remote work contract or policy?
Look, as indicated earlier, it is very important to ensure that there is a written agreement in place detailing remote work arrangements, and they're likely to vary from individual to individual. But there are a number of terms I'd regard as essential. First, the contract should set out the period of the remote working arrangements. Employers should consider a trial period to ensure that the arrangement is working smoothly and to give them the ability to make adjustments if it isn't. Employees should reserve the right, though, to direct employees to come into the office when required on short notice. For the reasons discussed earlier, the contract should restrict where the remote work can be performed. The contract should contain restrictions on working days and hours to avoid an employer having to pay overtime or other allowances. The agreement should also require the employee to take regular rest breaks. On the flip side, the employer should require the employee to be contactable and available during working hours. The contract should contain a requirement that the employer properly records the hours and the work that the employee performs. These records should regularly be checked by management. Employees should also consider setting out clear deliverables and performance requirements whilst the employee is remote working, and that will enable them to assess the employee's performance down the track. These should be variable and updated from year to year. The contract should also contain a requirement that the employee complies with the employer's work health and safety policies. This would usually include, for example, a requirement that the employee completes safety audit checklists, that the employee maintains a safe workplace, that the employee alerts the employee to any health risks or issues encountered by the employee. Employees should also consider reserving a right to enter and review the workplace. The contract should contain more robust terms for the protection of confidential and private documents. Employees should require employees to minimise the amount of hard copy documents which they retain at home, and also require them to keep those documents secure. Finally, the contract should clearly set out who will be responsible for what office expenses. I can tell you printing can be particularly expensive these days.
For sure, Michael. Thanks for that. If I can change tack a little bit and ask Celeste, do you have any tips for employers in terms of managing the remote workforce, in particular performance and disciplinary processes?
Yeah, so I think that's an important question. And when we look at, managing a workforce or remote workforce, there are two broad aspects to consider. I think the first would be in respect of monitoring and managing performance. And the second aspect, would be that, if there are conduct or performance issues, then in terms of managing the disciplinary process as well as the disciplinary actions, including terminations. So on the first aspect, of monitoring and managing performance, it is important to review existing policies and put in place appropriate policies tailored for monitoring and managing performance in a remote working environment. So for example, there should be in place, clear, defined deliverables on how performance and productivity will be measured and monitored, from the outset in a remote environment. So ensure, for example, that written agreements with employees, are clear on job description, working hours, deliverables. Ensure that there is, a process for regular and ongoing feedback to remote employees, and document performance appraisals accurately. So we have seen many companies leveraging technology and employment management platforms for these purposes. And what is key to sort of bear in mind would be data privacy issues. So that's the first aspect. Then on the second aspect, in terms of managing disciplinary process as well as disciplinary actions, again, I think it is important to review your current policies to ensure that they are appropriate for purposes of conducting, for example, your disciplinary meetings or processes remotely. So you need to think about, how will the process be conducted? Are there any local law requirements or company policies which actually require physical meetings as opposed to, remote or virtual meetings? So the key is that, certain laws are fairly prescriptive as to how these processes should be done. So you do need to look at the local laws. The second one is, obviously in a remote environment, how do you ensure that you mitigate the risk of employee recording the session, for example, because you can't really quite see that. Or ensuring that there's somebody else in the room, or rather mitigating the risk of somebody else being in the room. And then the next issue is in terms of data security, right? I mean, is the matter so sensitive that, a remote hearing or a remote process may not be appropriate? And then the last point really is, again, look at your technology. Is it equipped? Is your technology equipped to actually conduct, these disciplinary processes online? So, the key point here really is to ensure that you do have the necessary facilities and technology to be able to conduct, these disciplinary processes virtually.
Thanks, Celeste. Really good tips. Now back to who should be paying for home office expenses, which Michael left off in when he spoke to us last. So Sonia, maybe if I could hear from you. So who should actually be paying for home office expenses and printed ink?
In short, from a legal perspective, there are no clear answers to this. Different jurisdictions have different rules. In some jurisdictions, there are actually statutory requirements for employers to reimburse their employees for reasonable and necessary expenses that they incur in direct consequence of discharging their duties. But the difficulty is often whether certain expenses are reasonable and necessary. In some other jurisdictions, employees cannot be required to bear any of their employer's business costs. But again, the difficulty is to determine whether certain costs are business costs or whether they are personal costs. In some jurisdictions, there are no statutory rules in relation to these issues. So therefore, in general, as Michael mentioned earlier, it's very important to have clear policies. Employers should also review their existing employment contracts and handbook and policies, and to determine whether there are any contractual obligations to reimburse employees for these type of expenses. Employers, when they set out their work from home policies, should clearly communicate to their employees what the policy is, so that everyone understands the expectations. So clarity in communication is particularly important. If an employer does not otherwise provide the employee with the tools necessary for the employees to work remotely, as the employee may expect or assume that those costs will be reimbursed. The communication should also make it clear whether the reimbursement arrangements are meant to be temporary or permanent. In terms of market practice, we are aware that many employers provide work laptops to their employees. Some employers may also reimburse for headsets, chairs, additional computer monitors, or even faster internet connections charges. But whether or not these expenses should be reimbursed will largely depend on the actual circumstances. There was a very recent Australian case on office equipment. The employees alleged that he was constructively dismissed because his employer directed him to work from home, but refused to provide him with pay or to pay for the desk at his home. But however, the employer in that case actually already offered to provide employees with equipment and supports in terms of laptops, headsets, adjustable chairs, economic assessments, or even access to an occupational therapist and online resources. So in that case, the Fair Works Commission held that the failure by the employer to provide that to the remote worker did not amount to constructive dismissal. So this case demonstrated that from a legal perspective, whilst employers should provide adequate equipment to allow their employees to perform work if they are requested to work from home, there is a limit on what needs to be provided. So employers should assess what is reasonable and necessary on a case-by-case basis when requiring employees to work from home.
Thank you very much, Sonia. So certainly, I think it's been very interesting. It's been a little bit of a whirlwind, but as we look at the modern workforce and remote working policies, there are lots to think about. How your contracts should change. Who pays for what expenses, what disciplinary measures as well as processes you put in place, and also how you look after the employee, given that you may not have so much physical face-to-face time with them. So as we move on into a new era and a new modern workforce, these are certainly some things that companies do need to consider. And if you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists today at Baker Mckenzie. So it just leaves me to thank the speakers. And on behalf of Michael, Celeste, Sonia, and myself, thank you very much for attending, and thank you for that, and hope you have a really great rest of the FinTech Festival.